You just bought yourself a $10 coffin, Arthur, and you'll be buried in your own mud. That was the sharp, metallic voice of Marcus Sterling, the chief loan officer of the Farmers and Merchants Bank, ringing out across the frozen asphalt of the Buchanan County Courthouse yard. It was a bitter Tuesday morning in November of 1978. The wind cutting down from the north was fierce enough to turn the puddles into jagged sheets of gray ice, and the auctioneer's breath came out in thick, ragged clouds that hung in the frozen air. Behind Sterling stood Chad Vance, the regional director for the brand-new John Deere megastore that had just opened on the highway. Chad was wearing a heavy sheepskin coat that cost more than my entire winter seed budget, his leather boots completely untouched by the rural clay. He was holding a shiny gold cross pen, tapping it against a clipboard loaded with foreclosure notices. When the auctioneer dropped the gavel on Parcel 14, a 40-acre strip of discarded industrial bottomland known locally as the Slick 40, nobody had raised a hand. Nobody except me. The bidding had started at $50. Nothing. The auctioneer dropped it to $20. Still, the crowd of 30 broke farmers stood with their hands shoved deep into their canvas pockets, staring at their boots. That piece of ground was a local horror story. For 40 years, an old steam railway repair depot had dumped its heavy engine oil, coal slag, and boiler ash straight into the low-lying marsh. The topsoil was covered in a thick, iridescent black crust that smelled faintly of kerosene and rot. The county extension agent had officially classified it as technically dead and non-arable 5 years prior. "Give me anything," the auctioneer had groaned, his voice cracking in the cold. "Somebody give me $10 just to clear the tax deed." I raised my cracked, grease-stained left hand. $10, I said. A collective chuckle went through the co-op crowd. Chad Vance leaned over to Sterling and whispered something that made the banker smirk. The gavel fell. Sold to Arthur Vance for one crisp, frayed $10 bill. Paid in cash right there on the frozen hood of my old Ford truck. "Arthur," Chad said as he walked past me toward his heated sedan, his smile dripping with small-town pity. "You can't grow a single bushel of feed corn on that industrial waste. The nitrogen level is 0, and the heavy metals will kill a goat. You paid $10 too much for 40 acres of poison." I carefully folded the Pink County tax deed, placed it inside the breast pocket of my faded denim jacket next to my father's old silver pocket watch, and looked at the two men. My face didn't betray a single thought. "Guess I'll find out what it's good for," I murmured. They left, their heavy tires crunching over the gravel, leaving me alone in the freezing square. They looked at the land through the lens of modern chemical spreadsheets, thinking that if you couldn't drench a field in synthetic ammonia and drive a $100,000 air-conditioned tractor through it, the soil was worthless. But there was one thing the state assessors and the smart corporate buyers didn't understand. They didn't know about the handwritten ledger sitting in my kitchen table drawer, dated September of 1947. They didn't know that the ground wasn't dead. It was just buried under a layer of human ignorance, waiting for the one machine and the one man who still remembered how to listen to the dirt. That same afternoon, I drove my old truck out to the eastern edge of the Slick 40. The access track was completely washed out, choked with wild willow scrub and deep ruts that would snap a modern aluminum axle clean in half. I parked at the boundary line and walked into the center of my new 40 acres. The ground beneath my heavy winter boots was soft, greasy black mud beneath a brittle, shifting crust of ice. The smell was sharp, chemical, and ancient, like old iron filings mixed with deep anaerobic marsh rot. Every step I took left an oily rainbow ring in the standing gray water. I knelt down in the freezing mud, pulling a small brass soil probe from my pocket. I pushed it down through the black tarry layer. At exactly 14 inches deep, the resistance changed. The tip hit something firm, fibrous, and packed dense. When I pulled the probe back up, the tip wasn't covered in toxic coal slag. It was coated in a deep, chocolate-brown organic silt that looked like old forest loam. I wiped the soil against my thumb and brought it to my nose. Beneath the faint smell of engine oil from the surface, there was the unmistakable, rich, sweet scent of living humic earth. My grandfather had always said that nature is lazy, but she never lies. For 40 years, the heavy industrial runoff had acted as a perfect, impenetrable seal, keeping the deep, prehistoric river-bottom soil underneath completely untouched by the intensive, chemical-heavy farming that had depleted every other acreage in the county. The toxic mud wasn't a curse. It was a shield. But to unlock that treasure 14 inches beneath the poison, I couldn't use a modern, heavy John Deere tractor with electronic weight limiters and wide rubber tires that would instantly sink to the frame in the slick marsh. I needed something with massive mechanical leverage, high ground clearance, and steel, narrow wheels that could slice through the toxic crust like a hot knife through lard. I needed to go back into my machine shed and wake up the ghost that had been sleeping under a grease tarp since the winter of 1965. The machine shed on the north quarter of my homestead didn't have electricity, and it didn't have concrete floors. It was built in 1938 out of rough-sawn white oak timbers that had cured until they were as hard as structural iron. The floor was packed clay, mixed with 40 years of dropped lock washers, spilled mineral spirits, and dried corn husks. Underneath a massive, dust-choked canvas tarp at the very back of that dark shed sat my father's 1952 Farmall Super M. The paint had long faded to the dark, flat hue of dried beef blood. The two front tires, set narrow in the classic tricycle design, were dry-rotted so deep that the cracks looked like topographical maps of the Badlands. Baling wire held the left side steel fender to the axle housing, and the seat was nothing but an exposed cast-iron pan with a rusted coil spring underneath. To the younger men who bought their machinery through 60-month corporate credit lines at the dealership down the highway, this tractor was a relic. It didn't have an enclosed cab, it didn't have power steering, and it didn't have a microchip anywhere inside its four-cylinder block. It was raw, unadorned iron. Chad Vance had seen it once from the road and told the co-op board it was a safety hazard that belonged in a scrapyard. But Chad Vance was a salesman who looked at horsepower ratings on slick, glossy brochures. He didn't understand the physical reality of low RPM torque, and he certainly didn't understand the concept of drawbar pull. I stepped over a stack of old tractor manuals and pulled the heavy canvas tarp free. The smell of old graphite grease and dried mice nests instantly filled the cold air of the shed. I laid my grandfather's heavy oak toolbox on the iron hood, the latches clicking open with a loud metallic snap. The task ahead wasn't just to make the engine turn over, it was to prepare this old machine to face a swamp that had swallowed an entire industrial rail line. Modern tractors, with their wide rubber tires and massive gross vehicle weight, would pull up to the edge of the slick 40, spin their tires twice in the oily black crust, and sink straight down until their high-tech planetary axles were resting on the mud. The Farmall Super M was different. It was engineered during an era when American fields weren't perfectly drained tile systems. Its narrow front end allowed it to pick a line between willow hummocks, and its tall, 38-inch rear steel wheels were designed to cut straight through the surface slurry until they found a hard pan underneath. I spent the next 3 days in that cold shed by the light of a kerosene lantern. My hands, already stiff from the November chill, became blackened with 50-weight non-detergent oil. First, I pulled the spark plugs. They were fouled with carbon from the last time my father had run the machine in the summer of '65. I didn't throw them away. Modern replacement plugs had brittle ceramic casings that couldn't handle the heat of an old low-compression head. I cleaned the old Champion plugs with a brass wire brush and a can of white gas, setting the gap precisely by using an old leaf-type feeler gauge that my grandfather had brought back from France in 1918. Next came the carburetor, a simple, gravity-fed Marvel-Schebler cast-iron unit. It was choked with a yellow, varnish-like gum left behind by decades of evaporated gasoline. I took the entire assembly apart on my wooden workbench, cleaning the main jet and the idle emulsion tube with a single strand of copper wire stripped from an old piece of telephone line. There were no rubber O-rings here, no delicate plastic floats that would dissolve in modern ethanol fuel. Everything was brass, copper, and cast iron. On the fourth morning, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. I filled the radiator with 5 gallons of steaming water from the kitchen stove to warm the cylinder sleeves, then poured 3 gallons of fresh tractor-grade gasoline into the steel tank. I didn't use an electric starter. The old 6-volt battery had died during the Eisenhower administration. I inserted the heavy iron hand crank into the front of the tractor's bolster, right beneath the radiator grill. I braced my left hand against the steel frame rail, took a deep breath, and pulled up on the iron crank handle with everything my 74-year-old back had left. The engine groaned. The heavy cast-iron flywheel inside the clutch housing turned over slow, the thick oil resisting the movement. I cranked it a second time. Nothing but a hollow mechanical hiss as the intake valves drew in the cold air. On the third pull, I adjusted the choke cable by 1/2 inch, set the magneto spark advance, and threw my weight into the upward stroke. The Farmall coughed. A thick plume of blue smoke shot straight up out of the vertical exhaust pipe, rattling the tin rain cap on top. Then, with a deep, primeval growl, the 4-cylinder engine caught. The 4-inch pistons found their cadence, settling instantly into a slow, perfectly steady, low RPM rhythm that vibrated through the packed clay floor beneath my boots. Chug, 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 chug. It wasn't the high-pitched, screaming whine of Chad Vance's modern multi-valve turbodiesels. It was the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of an older America. A sound that carried no debt, no computing errors, and no compromise. I let the engine idle for 20 minutes until the cast-iron manifold was hot enough to sizzle when the condensation from the roof dripped onto it. Then, I climbed into the iron seat pan, shoved the long-throw gearshift lever into first, and let out the foot-operated clutch. The tall rear tires turned, the heavy steel cleats biting into the frozen dirt of the driveway as the old machine rolled out into the winter light. My destination that morning wasn't the local seed store or the grain elevator where the younger farmers were already lining up to refinance their loans. My destination was the county library in Fairfield. I needed to find the second half of the puzzle my grandfather had left behind in his 1947 ledger. He hadn't just planted something in that toxic mud. He had used a specific ecological method that the modern extension office had completely forgotten. As I drove the Farmall down the shoulder of County Road 14, the cold wind blasting against my face, I saw Marcus Sterling standing outside the bank in town, talking to an appraiser in a suit. He looked up as the rhythmic thumping of the old tractor approached. He didn't say a word, but he shook his head and pulled his wool collar tighter against his neck. He thought I was just an old man playing with an expensive pile of junk. He didn't realize that the old iron was running perfectly, and the clock on his corporate banking system was already starting to tick downward. The old Carnegie Library building in Fairfield was constructed in 1902 out of dark red brick, and inside, the floorboards creaked with a heavy, hollow sound that made you lower your voice out of instinct. Mrs. Evers was sitting behind the main desk under a green-shaded lamp, her fingers clicking rhythmically on an old mechanical typewriter. She didn't look up when the bell above the oak door rang. She just listened to the heavy, slow thud of my boots on the wood. "The agriculture section hasn't moved, Arthur," she said softly, her eyes remaining on her paper. "Back corner, under the frosted window." I walked down the narrow aisle, the smell of aged paper, leather bindings, and linseed oil hanging heavy in the air. I wasn't looking for the modern university extensions on nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratios, or chemical herbicide applications. I was looking for a specific, out-of-print text that my father had mentioned during the wet spring of 1952. After 10 minutes of searching the bottom shelves where the dust settled thickest, I found it. Marsh Plants of Economic Value, published in 1936 by the Iowa State Agricultural College. The cover was a faded mottled gray cloth, and the pages were thick and fibrous. I sat down at a long oak table, opened my father's 1945 ledger on top of the book, and began to read Chapter 4. The text detailed a method of soil remediation that had been used by early German immigrants in the Ohio River Valley. When land was contaminated by coal soot, railway grease, or industrial iron slag, they didn't try to scrape the surface off. They used a biological sequence called hyperaccumulation. First, you clemented the soil with wild cattail roots, Typha latifolia. The cattail's thick, segmented rhizomes acted like living sponges. Their cellular structures had a rare ability to bind heavy metals and lock them inside the plant's fibrous cores, separating the toxins from the surrounding water table. But the second part of the sequence was the true secret. Once the cattails had stabilized the top 14 inches of toxic crust, you introduced deep-rooting wild clover and native sweetgrass. The clover didn't just fix nitrogen from the air into the depleted dirt. Its roots exuded a specialized enzyme that broke down the complex, tarry hydrocarbons of old railway grease into simple organic sugars, feeding the native soil biology that had been dormant for half a century. My grandfather's ledger from September 1947 contained 7 words on the third page from the back. Planted rootstock, North Quarter bottomland. Let it grow wild. He hadn't been trying to grow a crop for his own harvest. He had seen the industrial pollution spreading from the depot, and he had set a 50-year biological clock in motion. He had sacrificed his own immediate return so that 3 generations later the soil would remember how to be clean. I closed the book, made notes on the back of an old co-op receipt with a stubby pencil, and drove the Farmall back to the homestead. The quiet work began that winter and stretched into a long, silent sequence of years. For 7 summers, from 1978 to 1985, I became a ghost on my own 40 acres. Every morning at 5:30, before the sun could clear the line of cottonwood trees along the creek, the steady, low RPM thump of the Farmall Super M would start up in the north shed. I built a heavy, flat-bottomed wooden sled out of 2x4s and an old truck tailgate. I hitched it to the tractor's drawbar with a 3/4-inch log chain my grandfather had bought in 1928, and I rolled out into the slick black mud of the Slick 40. The work was brutal, repetitive, and entirely invisible to the outside world. Using a wooden-handled machete and a heavy spade, I picked a line through the frozen willow scrub. I cut back the dead willow stalks, piled the brush on the high gravel ridges to dry, and systematically divided the thick cattail rhizomes, transplanting them into the dense tarry sections where the industrial crust was thickest. By the 3rd year, the eastern quarter of the swamp had transformed. The wild reed canary grass had been choked out and replaced by a massive uniform stand of cattails that grew waist-high by June and turned a rich golden brown by late September. The younger farmers down at the Greenfield feed store didn't see the biological transformation happening beneath the surface. They only saw an old man slogging through a toxic marsh with an antique tractor, his hands permanently blackened with organic muck and graphite grease. Every Saturday morning, I'd walk into the Greenfield Co-op to buy a 10-cent cup of black coffee and a box of baling twine. The room would always go quiet for a second, the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked to the counter. "Hey, Arthur," Chad Vance would call out from the center table, where he sat with Marcus Sterling and 3 of the largest landowners in the county. "How's the mud crop coming along? I see you're still running that rust bucket. John Deere's got a finance plan right now on a 60-horsepower utility tractor that would pull you out of the 50s if your bank account can handle the entry fee." The table would laugh, a low, comfortable sound made by men who were watching their paper wealth grow by 30% every year on bank credit sheets. Marcus Sterling would tap his calculator, his gold ring catching the fluorescent light. "Don't waste your breath, Chad," Sterling would smirk, taking a sip from his mug. "Arthur doesn't believe in leverage. He likes his assets like his tractors, old, slow, and buried in dirt. I never argued. I didn't tell them that while they were spending thousands of dollars on synthetic liquid ammonia to force unnatural yields from their depleted ridges, my cattail roots were drawing pristine humic nutrients from 14 inches below the surface. I didn't tell them that the black crust on my 40 acres was dissolving, turning into a rich, sweet, organic loam that didn't owe a single penny to the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I just paid for my twine in cash, nodded to the clerk, and walked back out to my truck. While they were feeding their soil with credit, I was feeding mine with time. By the summer of 1985, the cattail stand had expanded to cover nearly 12 acres of the parcel. The water running out of the southern drainage ditch into Stony Creek was no longer gray and covered in an oily sheen. It was perfectly clear, cool, and filtered clean by millions of fibrous root hairs. Then, the weather broke. The rain stopped on the 10th of July, and the sky turned into a vast, hard bowl of blue glass that didn't allow a single cloud to form for 40 days. The great drought of 1985 had arrived, and with it came a financial reckoning that would strip the pride off Buchanan County like a wire brush on rust. By the second week of August 1985, the wind blowing across Buchanan County felt like the exhaust from a commercial grain dryer. The topsoil on the high ridges, heavily saturated with synthetic chemical fertilizers for over a decade, had lost its natural organic binding capacity. Without moisture, it simply disintegrated. Thick, blinding clouds of yellow dust rolled across Highway 20, clogging the air intakes of the modern turbo-diesel tractors and turning the noon sun into a pale, sickly copper disk. In the air-conditioned booths at the local diner, the laughing had stopped completely. The coffee went cold on the counter as men stared at the Wall Street Journal commodity sheets with hollow, unblinking eyes. The price of corn had collapsed by 40% in less than 30 days, driven down by a global trade embargo and an overproduction crisis. At the same time, the Federal Reserve had ratcheted the baseline interest rates up toward an unprecedented 20% to combat inflation. It was the perfect financial hammer, and it was falling straight onto the heads of the farmers who had leveraged their land to buy bigger acreage and shinier machinery. Debt looked like freedom until the bank called it due. On a Tuesday morning, I drove the old Chevy pickup into Greenfield to buy a replacement hydraulic hose for my log splitter. As I pulled up to the intersection of Main Street, I saw a crowd of 50 or 60 people gathered outside the brick facade of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. They weren't talking. They were just standing there in their overalls and dusty caps, watching a team of county deputies bolt a heavy, white plywood sign to the double oak doors. The sign read, "Foreclosure Sale, by order of the bank and the county sheriff." Marcus Sterling was standing on the stone steps, his wool suit trousers fluttering in the hot, dusty wind. He didn't look like a financial genius anymore. His gold ring was gone, likely sold or hidden, and his face was the color of skim milk. The bank's bad debt reserves had dried up, and corporate auditors from Chicago had taken over his ledger. They didn't care about family names, and they didn't care about 30-year relationships. They only cared about signatures on collateral agreements. Right next to him stood Chad Vance. The brilliant glass showroom of his John Deere dealership was completely locked up, the keys turned over to a federal bankruptcy receiver. Row after row of brand-new computerized green combines sat in his lot with white repossessed tags fluttering from their hydraulic lines. The microchips and the enclosed cabs couldn't save them when the credit line went dry. Chad looked up and saw my rusted truck idling at the curb. For 7 years, he had called my Farmall Super M a safety hazard and a museum piece. Now he just looked at me with a desperate, sunken stare. He had $500,000 in uncollectible equipment notes, and the corporate office was threatening him with civil fraud charges for inflating trade-in values. I didn't gloat. I didn't lean out the window to ask him how his computer-mapped horsepower was handling the dust. I just shifted the Chevy back into first gear and drove slow down the street. My father had taught me that a man who takes pleasure in another man's financial ruin has already lost his own soul. But as I passed the dealership lot, I looked at the paid-for iron sitting in my own truck bed, and I knew that our 74 years of quiet patience had outlasted their 7 years of arrogant credit. While the rest of the county was drowning in red ink, something miraculous was happening down in the oily black mud of the Slick 40. The drought had lowered the water table by nearly 18 inches, exposing the true bottom soil for the first time since the old railway depot closed. The thick, iridescent black crust of heavy grease had been completely broken down by biological enzymes released by my golden brown cattail roots and the dense carpets of wild clover. What was left behind wasn't a toxic waste dump. It was a magnificent 3-foot-deep layer of pristine, virgin humic silt, soil that had been protected from chemical erosion for 50 years. And because the soil biology was alive and intact, it held moisture like an ancient sponge. While the neighbors' high-input cornfields were pale, bleached, and crackling dry, the central acreage of the Slick 40 was a dense, vibrant oasis of deep organic life. On October 12th, a black Lincoln Continental with out-of-state plates pulled down my gravel driveway, kicking up a rooster tail of gray dust. 2 men in gray linen suits stepped out, carrying heavy leather briefcases. They said they represented an international organic agricultural trust based out of Minneapolis. They had been running aerial soil surveys across the Midwest, looking for land that had 0 pesticide residue, 0 chemical fertilizer contamination, and high humic density for premium medicinal crop production. The lead buyer laid a legal document on the weathered hood of my old truck. "Arthur," he said, his voice completely clear of any small-town small talk. "We checked the county deed records. You bought the Slick 40 for $10 at a tax sale 7 years ago. Our lab just ran a satellite core analysis on the bottom layer of that soil. It's the cleanest organic humic silt left in the entire state of Iowa. We are prepared to offer you an initial contract price of $4,000 per acre, cash, to buy out the title." I looked down at the paper. 40 acres at $4,000 an acre was $160,000. For a piece of toxic mud that Marcus Sterling had called an open coffin. "No," I said softly, my voice steady. The buyer blinked, his sleek pen stopping mid-air. "Arthur, that's a capital gain of over 1,000,000%. You're an old man with a rusted machine shed. Why on earth would you say no?" "Because you're looking at the numbers on the paper," I said, leaning against my truck fender. "But you don't understand. The courthouse yard is holding an asset sale next Tuesday, and the bank isn't the one holding the gavel anymore." The gravel area surrounding the Buchanan County Courthouse was packed denser than a county fair grandstand on a Saturday night in August. It was Tuesday morning, October 22, 1985. The cold wind coming off the northern plains didn't just bring the autumn chill. It brought the bitter smell of dried dust and broken promises. Over 200 farmers from 3 different counties stood shoulder to shoulder in their faded canvas jackets, their faces drawn into hard, unblinking masks of silent anger. They weren't here to buy. They were here to watch the corporate system strip away what was left of the county's history. Marcus Sterling stood behind a makeshift wooden podium on the stone steps of the courthouse, his fingers trembling slightly as he sorted through a stack of legal foreclosure ledgers. Beside him, Chad Vance leaned against the cold stone pillar, his eyes bloodshot, looking down at his polished leather loafers, which were now coated in a fine layer of gray Iowa dust. The Chicago auditors had already completed their analysis. Every single asset on the bank's book had to be liquidated to satisfy the outstanding credit notes. "All right, folks, let's settle down," Sterling's voice croaked through an old battery-powered megaphone, the sound screeching with feedback. "By order of the Farmers and Merchants Bank and the bankruptcy receiver for the state of Iowa, we are opening the public bidding for the land holdings and equipment assets of Buchanan County. First item on the ledger is the agricultural title to the properties commonly known as the Central Ridges, totaling 400 acres of high-yield cropland, along with the contents of the highway dealership yard. The silence that followed his words was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The bank holds a primary lien of $640,000 on these combined assets, Sterling continued, his hand reaching up to nervously adjust his wool collar. The bidding will open at a minimum reserve of $350,000 cash or certified banknote. Do I hear 350? Nobody moved. Not a single hand went up. The younger farmers just crossed their arms tighter against their chests, their coffee going completely cold in their plastic cups as they stared right through the banker. They knew that land had been drenched in synthetic nitrogen until the soil biology was completely dead, and the machinery in Chad's lot was tied to computerized software keys that the factory had already deactivated. "Come on, gentlemen," Sterling's voice took on a desperate, pleading pitch. "The equipment alone is worth $200,000 on paper. Someone give me an opening bid. We need to clear this debt sheet." "That paper wealth won't grow a single bushel of corn in a dry season, Marcus," a voice called out from the back of the crowd. It was an old-school operator from Greenfield, his voice cutting through the wind like a bastard file on a steel edge. "And those green tractors won't pull a three-bottom plow across a clay ridge without a microchip from Chicago. It's scrap iron wrapped in plastic." A low murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Chad Vance's face turned from pale to an angry, mottled dark red. He snatched the megaphone from Sterling's hand and stepped to the edge of the stone steps. "You old-timers think you know better?" Chad shouted, his voice cracking with arrogant frustration. "You're standing here with empty pockets because you're terrified of progress. This machinery is the future of American agriculture. If you can't see the horsepower rating on these specifications, you deserve to lose your farms." Before the crowd could react to his insult, the slow, steady, unmistakable thumping rhythm of a four-cylinder engine began to echo down Main Street. Chug, 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 chug. The rhythmic vibrations bounced off the brick facades of the storefronts, traveling straight through the frozen asphalt until everyone in the square could feel it in their boots. The crowd slowly parted, creating a wide path down the center of the gravel yard. Rolling into the courthouse square was my 1952 Farmall Super M. The narrow front wheels picked a clean line over the frozen ruts, and its tall 38-inch rear tires moved with unyielding traction. Hitching behind the tractor's drawbar by a heavy 3/4-inch log chain was my old flat-bottomed wooden sled. But today, it wasn't loaded with bundles of cattails or willow brush. Sitting on top of the oak timbers were 3 large canvas sacks tied tight with orange baling twine, and an envelope stamped with the official blue seal of the Iowa State Agricultural Testing Laboratory. I cut the throttle, letting the Farmall settle into its low, rhythmic idle that filled the silence of the yard. I climbed down from the iron seat pan, the gravel crunching under my heavy winter boots as I walked toward the stone steps. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't look at the repo tags hanging from Chad's locked combines. I laid the sealed testing report directly onto Marcus Sterling's wooden podium, right on top of his foreclosure ledger. "Arthur," Sterling whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the document. "What is this?" "That ground you called an open coffin 7 years ago, Marcus," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet square. "The lab just finished the biological core assessment. The cattail roots didn't just filter out the heavy metals from the old railway depot. They also protected the deep humic silt underneath. The deep-rooting clover has broken down every tarry hydrocarbon into simple organic compounds. That 40 acres of toxic mud is now officially certified as the highest density, non-residue organic soil in the entire Midwest." I reached into the canvas sacks on the sled, pulled out a thick, 3-foot-long segmented rootstock coated in rich, dark, chocolate-brown organic silt, and laid it beside the paper. The International Organic Agricultural Trust from Minneapolis just signed a standing purchase contract for every acre of that bottomland, I continued, looking directly into the banker's eyes. They paid cash on delivery for the biological yield numbers. I didn't take their money to buy a shiny new machine on credit, Marcus. I took it to settle a debt sheet. I opened my jacket pocket, pulled out a certified bank check from the Farmers and Merchants Bank's own rival in Columbus, and placed it on the podium. The amount written on the ledger was exactly $350,000, the precise reserve price for the entire Central Ridges property and the contents of the dealership. "I am opening the bidding at the reserve," I murmured, my face remaining perfectly calm. "Paid for cash. No financing notes, no interest rates, and no signatures required from your Chicago auditors." Marcus Sterling picked up the check with both hands, his eyes running over the certified seal twice. His face went completely pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at Chad Vance, then looked out over the crowd of 200 farmers who were now watching him in total, breathless silence. The smart investors and the financial experts had run their numbers on slick paper for 7 years, thinking that credit expansion could replace practical wisdom and soil biology. Now, the entire county was watching them realize that the foolish old man with the rusty tractor was the only one left with enough cash to keep their system from collapsing. Chad Vance stepped forward, his fingers clawing at the stone pillar as he stared at the certified check. His voice was barely a whisper when the laughing finally stopped forever. "Arthur, you bought the dealership?" "No, son," I said, turning my back on the podium and walking slow back toward the idling iron of the Farmall Super M. "I bought back my father's original family land legacy. The showroom belongs to the county now. We're turning it back into a repair shop where a man can learn how to fix things with his own 2 hands again." I climbed back onto the tractor, threw the long gear lever into first, and let the old iron pull the sled slowly out of the square. Behind me, the grandstand crowd of Buchanan County didn't laugh. They just went deadly silent, watching the steel cleat wheels turn, remembering what modern steel forgets: that the land always remembers patience, and rust doesn't mean worthless. The laughing stopped. The legacy lives on.